Imagine you're walking through a prehistoric forest. The air is cool, the trees stretch endlessly above you, everywhere around you, life is making noise. Birds are calling to each other, insects are buzzing through the grass, leaves rustle gently in the wind. It's loud, but it's the kind of loud that feels normal. Then, everything stops. The birds fall silent. The insects disappear into complete stillness. Even the wind seems to hold its breath. For a brief moment, the entire forest becomes unnaturally quiet. If you were a modern person, you might think, how peaceful. But if you were an ancient human, that silence would send a wave of terror through your entire body. Your heart would race. Your muscles would tighten. Without thinking, you'd stop moving. Because in the prehistoric world, silence rarely meant safety. It often meant that something dangerous had just arrived. Something every other animal had already noticed before you did. But why would the complete absence of sound be far more terrifying than the loudest roar? For ancient humans, silence wasn't normal. In fact, a completely quiet world almost never existed. From the moment they woke up until they fell asleep, they lived inside a world filled with sound. High above the trees, birds constantly called to one another. Insects buzzed through the grass and under the leaves. The wind whispered through branches, carrying scents and distant noises across the forest. Nearby streams never stopped flowing. Every step through dry leaves or loose stones created its own small sound. Back at the camp, people talked, laughed, argued, and shared stories around the fire. The flames crackled through the night. Children played. Tools struck against stone. Life was noisy. And that noise wasn't just background. It was information. Without realizing it, the human brain was listening to thousands of tiny sounds every second. Not because it wanted to, but because survival depended on it. A bird suddenly taking flight. A herd changing direction. Branches snapping somewhere in the distance. Even the smallest change could reveal something important. Long before humans built walls, long before they invented alarms, nature itself was their warning system. Every sound helped answer one simple question. Am I safe? If the forest sounded normal, everything was probably fine. But the moment that familiar rhythm changed, their brains noticed immediately. Not through careful thinking, but through millions of years of evolution. To an ancient human, listening wasn't a choice. It was an instinct. A survival tool sharpened over countless generations. Because in the prehistoric world, the difference between hearing something and not hearing something could be the difference between going home or never returning at all. So what happened? When this endless natural soundtrack suddenly stopped, the reason was surprisingly simple. Animals almost always sensed danger before humans did. Long before an ancient hunter could spot a predator, the forest had already noticed. A flock of birds would suddenly explode into the sky. Monkeys would stop calling from the treetops. Deer would freeze in place. Every muscle locked. Every ear focused on a single direction. Even insects, the tiny creatures that filled the forest with endless buzzing, could suddenly fall silent. At first glance, these changes seemed ordinary. But to ancient humans, they were messages. The forest was speaking. Not with words, but with silence. Over thousands of generations, humans began recognizing the pattern. Whenever the sounds of nature disappeared, something dangerous was often nearby. Maybe a lion was slowly moving through the tall grass. Maybe a leopard was crouched silently on a tree branch, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In colder regions, it could have been a saber-toothed cat stalking its next meal. Or perhaps a pack of hungry hyenas was circling in the shadows. Watching. Waiting. Looking for the weakest target. These predators had one thing in common. They didn't announce their arrival. The most successful hunters were the quietest ones. They relied on surprise. By the time you actually saw them, it was often too late. But the other animals usually noticed first. And their behavior became an unwritten warning system for anyone paying attention. Ancient humans didn't survive because they were the fastest or the strongest. They survived because they learned to read nature's signals. A sudden silence wasn't treated as a coincidence. It was treated as evidence. Evidence that somewhere nearby, a pair of unseen eyes might already be watching. The forest hadn't become empty. It had become cautious. And if every animal was suddenly acting like something dangerous had arrived, you had only one smart choice. Stop, listen, and prepare to run. Because silence wasn't random. It was information. But predators weren't the only reason silence became terrifying. But something even more fascinating was happening. The real change wasn't taking place in the forest. It was happening inside the human brain. Imagine surviving one terrifying encounter after another. One day, the forest suddenly goes silent. And moments later, a leopard attacks. Weeks later, the same silence returns. This time, a pack of hyenas appears. Months later, again, the birds stop singing. Again, danger follows. Your brain doesn't see these as separate events. It connects them. Over time, it builds a simple survival shortcut. Silence could mean danger. And if silence could mean danger, it was safer to react immediately than to wait for proof. This is how evolution shaped the human mind. The brain wasn't designed to be perfectly accurate. It was designed to keep you alive. The moment the familiar sounds disappeared, your body didn't wait for permission. Your heart started beating faster. Your breathing became shallow. Your muscles tightened. Adrenaline rushed through your bloodstream. Within seconds, your body entered fight or flight mode. Not because you had seen a predator, but because your brain believed one might be there. This instinct became stronger with every generation. The humans who reacted quickly were more likely to survive. The ones who ignored the warning often didn't get a second chance. Over thousands of years, that survival instinct became deeply wired into the human brain. It didn't have to be taught in words. Children learned it simply by growing up in the wild. They watched adults suddenly fall silent. They saw hunters stop walking the moment the forest changed. They noticed the fear on everyone's faces, even before anyone explained why. Slowly, their own brains learned the same lesson. Silence wasn't just quiet. Silence demanded attention. And this is where psychology began to take over. Because once the brain expects danger, it starts searching for it everywhere. A shadow between the trees suddenly looks alive. A fallen branch becomes the shape of a predator. Every dark bush feels like it's hiding something. The less your eyes could see, the more your imagination filled in the missing pieces. In many cases, the fear arrived long before the danger ever did. Sometimes there really was a predator nearby. But sometimes, there was nothing there at all. And sometimes, there wasn't any predator at all. But predators weren't the only reason the forest fell silent. Sometimes, the danger wasn't hiding behind a tree. It was nature itself. Long before humans understood weather or geology, animals could often sense changes that people couldn't. The air pressure shifted before a powerful storm. Tiny vibrations traveled through the ground before an earthquake. The smell of smoke drifted through the forest before flames became visible. Even volcanic eruptions could send subtle signals through the environment long before the explosion itself. Humans couldn't detect most of these changes. But the animals could. Birds suddenly abandoned their nests. Monkeys climbed higher into the trees or disappeared without warning. Deer quietly moved away from familiar grazing areas. Even insects, the constant background musicians of the forest, could suddenly fall silent. To an ancient human, the message was always the same. Something wasn't right. Imagine standing in the middle of a forest. Just moments ago, it was alive with sound. Now, the birds are gone. The insects have vanished. The wind feels strangely heavy. Nothing looks different. But everything feels different. You don't know if a storm is coming. You don't know if a wildfire is spreading somewhere beyond the trees. You don't know if the ground beneath your feet is about to shake. All you know is that nature has changed its behavior. And that alone is enough to make your heart race. Over countless generations, humans began recognizing this pattern. Whenever the natural soundtrack suddenly disappeared, something unusual often followed. Not always, but often enough that ignoring it became dangerous. Of course, silence wasn't always a warning. Sometimes the forest became quiet for completely harmless reasons. Maybe the animals had simply moved to another area. Maybe the wind had changed direction. Maybe nothing dangerous was happening at all. But evolution doesn't reward perfect certainty. It rewards survival. Imagine hearing silence 10 different times. 9 of those times, nothing happens. But the 10th time, a predator attacks. Or a massive tree crashes to the ground. Or a wildfire races through the forest. If you ignored all 10 warnings, you might not survive the one that mattered. But if you treated every silence as a possible threat, you might waste a little energy. Yet you would live to see another day. In evolution, making a harmless mistake is far less costly than making a fatal one. That's why our ancestors evolved to expect danger, even when danger wasn't there. Over thousands of years, silence became more than the absence of sound. It became a signal, a warning, a feeling that something invisible was about to happen. Eventually, silence stopped being just a sound, and became something much deeper. As thousands of years passed, something unexpected happened. The fear that had once protected human lives began to change. It slowly transformed into belief. Our ancestors didn't understand evolution. They didn't know about instincts, or adrenaline, or the way the brain learned from repeated danger. They only knew one thing. Whenever the world became unnaturally silent, Something important often followed. So they searched for an explanation. And when science didn't exist, imagination filled the gap. A silent forest was no longer just a quiet place. It became a place where invisible forces might be watching. Many people began believing that spirits lived in places where even the birds refused to sing. Dark, silent valleys were avoided after sunset. Dense forests untouched by human voices became sacred. Or cursed. Some believed the silence meant the presence of ancestors. Others believed it was a warning from unseen gods. And many feared that entering such places would bring death or misfortune. Across different civilizations, the stories changed. But the feeling remained surprisingly similar. Unusual silence was rarely seen as ordinary. It meant that something hidden, something powerful, was nearby. Over time, these warnings turned into traditions. Parents told children not to wander into silent forests alone. Hunters performed rituals before entering places where nature felt strangely still. Entire communities respected certain woods, mountains, or caves simply because they felt different. No one could prove why. But generations continued passing the fear to the next. Eventually, the original reason was forgotten. People no longer remembered that their ancestors had learned this fear by surviving predators and natural disasters. Instead, the silence itself became mysterious. What had once been a survival instinct slowly became folklore, then legend, then myth. And perhaps the strangest part of all, those ancient stories may have disappeared. But the feeling never did. Even today, most people feel uncomfortable in a place that is unnaturally quiet. Not because they believe a spirit is waiting in the darkness, but because somewhere deep inside the human brain, an ancient survival instinct is still quietly doing its job. And surprisingly, millions of years later, our brains still haven't forgotten. So what does all of this have to do with us today? After all, most of us don't have to worry about lions hiding outside our homes. Saber-toothed cats are long gone. And very few people will ever face a predator in the wild. So why does silence still make us uneasy? The answer is simple. Our world changed much faster than our brains did. Human civilization has existed for only a tiny fraction of our history. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors survived by treating unusual silence as a warning. That is the environment the human brain was built for. Cities replaced forests. Streetlights replaced campfires. Walls replaced caves. But evolution couldn't rewrite the brain overnight. It moves incredibly slowly. Which means, the same survival system that once protected prehistoric hunters is still running inside you today. Think about the last time you walked down a long, empty hallway. Nothing dangerous was there. Yet somehow, it felt unsettling. Or imagine standing alone in a silent forest. There are no predators waiting behind every tree. But your senses suddenly become sharper. You start listening to every tiny sound. Every snapping twig grabs your attention. Every shadow seems more important than it really is. Now picture sitting alone in a dark room. The house is completely quiet. Your eyes begin searching every corner. A pile of clothes starts looking like a person. A harmless creaking sound suddenly feels suspicious. Your imagination begins creating possibilities that logic never asked for. Or think about walking alone at night. You hear footsteps behind you. You turn around, and no one is there. Your heart speeds up anyway. Not because you've seen danger, but because your brain has learned that uncertainty itself deserves attention. This is one of evolution's oldest tricks. When information is missing, the brain doesn't like empty spaces. It fills them with possibilities. And those possibilities almost always lean toward danger. Because for our ancestors, assuming the worst was often the safest choice. It's far better to prepare for a threat that doesn't exist than to ignore the one that does. That's why complete silence still feels different. Not because silence itself is dangerous, but because your brain remembers a world where it often was. In many ways, we're living in a modern world. But we're experiencing it with a mind that was shaped in the Stone Age. And every time an unusual silence makes you stop, look around, or feel a little uneasy, you're hearing the echo of instincts that helped your ancestors survive for thousands of generations. So the next time you find yourself standing in a place where everything suddenly goes quiet, don't dismiss that strange feeling. Because you're experiencing something far older than fear itself. For our ancestors, silence was never just the absence of sound. It was a message, a warning, a question that every human brain had to answer. What changed? In a world filled with predators, natural disasters, and dangers hidden just beyond sight, the creatures that ignored unusual silence often didn't survive long enough to pass on their genes. But the ones who stopped, listened, and treated silence as a warning, lived. They protected their families. They reached another sunrise. And over countless generations, their instincts became our instincts. That's why even today, a quiet hallway can feel unsettling. A dark room can seem strangely alive. And a silent forest can make your heart beat just a little faster. Even when you know you're completely safe. Because your brain isn't only responding to the present. It's remembering a world that existed hundreds of thousands of years ago. A world where silence wasn't frightening because it was empty. It was frightening because it often meant something else was listening. And perhaps that's one of the most incredible things about being human. Inside every modern mind lives an ancient survivor. Still listening. Still watching. Still preparing. For dangers that disappeared long ago. Yet somehow, never completely left us.